Well, the phrase actually is a phrase that comes out of the public relations industry, which is the industry that was established by American business classes for the purpose of controlling the public mind. Back in the early part of the century, there was a significant growth of popular movements. Unions were winning victories. There's a very violent labor history in the United States, but there was progress. There were other popular forces, and there was an expansion of the franchise. And there is something that always happens, almost invariably under such circumstances. Privileged elites, when they recognize that they cannot control the public by force or by marginalization or by some other means, understand the necessity to control thought, to control the public mind. Now that goes all the way back, and it's very understandable. I have a recent book in which I trace it back to the elite reaction to the 17th century English revolutions, which were the first modern kind of popular uprising, popular democratic uprising. In any city, and it goes right up till today, whenever the population gets out of control, there's too much independent thought, there's a danger of democracy, there's involvement in the public arena, any of those threats, it's necessary to do something about it. States vary with respect to what they can do. There's a spectrum. At one extreme, you have states that just suppress it by violence. So what we call totalitarian states, or the kind of death squad democracies that the U.S. runs in its domain. There it's not a big problem. You just kill and torture and jail the people who speak up. But over time, especially in the wealthier societies, more industrial developed societies, popular struggles, and that's what's done it, have expanded the domain of freedom and have limited the capacity of the state and the social forces it represents to use force to control. And that has had there's a concomitant to that. The concomitant is the recognition that you have to have more and more sophisticated thought control. In a society where you can control people's behavior by force, you don't really care all that much about what they believe. You care some, because you have to have a degree of consent even in a totalitarian state. But you care less if you can control them with a bludgeon. As the capacity to wield the bludgeon declines, you care more about what they believe because it can make more of a difference. And the result is that an upsurge in a threat of democracy or popular engagement or something almost automatically leads to an increase in force to the extent that state has it available, and to an increase in propaganda, efforts to control the public mind. You can trace through the 20th century and see it just regularly. For example, wars and depressions and other crises have a way of making people think. They get people to pay attention to what's going on instead of being passive. And every such period leads to a popular upsurge of some kind. Every single one of them is followed by a repression and a huge increase in propaganda. The First World War was a case in point. It was followed by Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. That was the force side, and by a huge increase in the public relations industry and thought control and so on and so forth. That was the soft side. And things quieted down as a result of the attack on independent thought and unions and so on, which was a lot of the elite support, incidentally, and was pretty harsh. And the big upsurge in techniques for controlling the public mind. When the Depression came along in the 30s, the controls began to drop. People again became involved. There was another upsurge of union organization. It was pretty successful. Labor won its first legislative victory ever, really, in 1935 with the Wagner Act, also its last legislative victory. That led to a lot of concern, deep concern on the part of the business classes who basically run the country. The National Association of Manufacturers was talking about how the greatest threat to corporations is the organized activity of the masses. They have the very Marxists, these business groups with old vulgar Marxist rhetoric all the time. So there's this organized activity of the masses, and we've got to do something about that, and we can't control them by force, so we've got to turn to other techniques. Techniques is what were called scientific methods of strike breaking were developed, organizing the communities against the strikers in all sorts of ways. Techniques that are still used today. You can trace it right up to the yellow ribbons a couple of months ago. And along with it came repression. The repression was a little bit delayed because the Second World War came along, but immediately after the war, we go into a replay of the Red Scare. And all that quieted things down for a while. 1960s, again, kind of an upsurge, same reaction. The violent side, which was pretty violent, was the most striking part of it was the Cointelpro operations, the operations of the National Political Police, the FBI, mostly concerned with controlling dissent. They were very extensive. They were started by the Kennedy administration. They continued right up through, officially they continued into the Nixon administration. For all we know, they're still going on. There's, finally there was kind of an exposure, and then they theoretically stopped. They were no joke. They went as far as political assassination. Black Panther leader stirring up, stimulating violence in ghettos, efforts to undermine many of it succeeded. A lot of activist organizations ranging from the civil rights movement to the incipient at that time feminist movement to the New Left generally to the anti-war movement and so on. And on the other side there was a big explosion of propaganda. You could see this beginning right in the late 60s. Things were finally, really breaking up. For example, in the case of the war in Vietnam, the media were very supportive of the war, very hawkish. In fact, they always were. But after the Tet Offensive, there was a little, after, not during, contrary to what people say, there was a little bit of opening, and stories began to peek through about U.S. atrocities. The My Lai massacre was exposed, kind of unimportant considering the context. It was like a footnote. But it did get out. There were, the pictures of the guy getting shot in the streets, and there were direct stories of American bombing, and, had to destroy the village in order to save it. All that stuff was coming out. That immediately led to a huge propaganda campaign to restore passivity, to make it look like we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, to make them responsible, and us the victims in the Vietnam War. The method that was used was extremely sophisticated. The first good study of it that I've ever seen is just coming out, a book by Bruce Franklin called MIA, Mythology in America. And in fact, that's exactly what it was. Starting in the 60s, it was already going on. I remember my kids were, in elementary school, and there's this thing called the Weekly Reader. And I remember once one of my daughters came home from school with this thing, like around 1967, and the kids they give you kind of like activities you're supposed to do, and the activity that week was all the kids are supposed to write letters to Ho Chi Minh, asking him please release our innocent prisoners and let them go. They haven't done anything to you. That was the picture. The idea was that Ho Chi Minh had come to Main Street, Iowa, and had picked up these guys walking around and had taken them to Vietnam for the purpose of torturing them. And he was there, these sadistic tortures, and why don't you just let them go? We're just nice people, and so on. That was the picture. By 1969, that turned into an industry, not the Weekly Reader, but a huge industry involving the mass media, cinema, every possible thing, and to try to put the focus, the issue of the war, to become the American POWs. In fact, there are very few missing in action in Vietnam, far fewer than the Korean War, and way fewer than the Second World War. Second World War, the U.S. has complete access to the territory where they were killed. You walk around Belgium and so on. There's still, I think, hundreds of thousands, I don't know how many, huge numbers are missing in action. In fact, it's still picking up bodies from the War of 1812. This is, after the Korean War, after the Second World War, there was no ideological purpose to making an issue out of missing in action. But in this case, because there was no concern over American atrocities, by 1969 there was a big concern over the fact that the population was recognizing the violent atrocities and war crimes that the U.S. government was involved in. They had to invert it, and the technique is they're responsible. Look what they're doing to our POWs. So since then, there's been a huge campaign, everything from bracelets to movies, Rambo, the press, and so on missing in action. Well, that was brilliant, and it succeeded. It inverted the guilt. We're seeing it right now. Since we're the victims and they're the guilty ones, we will agree to deal with them if they're more forthcoming about the MIAs. That's the only issue. For 4 years, the Nixon administration was able to put off negotiations by condemning the Vietnamese as barbarians and so on, because they were saying what every country says in every war: we'll settle the POW issue together with the ending of the war. Well, it's always done. That's what they were saying. The whole media went into action. Barbaric statists, communist torturers, holding the POWs hostage. After the Second World War, we kept German POWs in working as forced labor in violation of every conceivable human rights convention for years. The British kept them until mid-1948. But nothing really matters. It's a media. It's a campaign. It was successful. Also, there was a recognition after the Vietnam War, a public recognition that the 60s were causing a problem, a big problem. The most important book that I've ever seen on this topic, and if you haven't read it, I urge that you do, is the one and only publication of the Trilateral Commission, 1975, a book called The Crisis of Democracy, which I've written about occasionally, and maybe some of you've seen it. It wasn't really intended to be read, and as soon as people started to talk about it, it immediately went out of print. But then when they forgot about it, it sort of came back in, so you can probably get it. The Trilateral Commission, as I'm sure you know, is the trilateral because it's Japan, Europe, and the United States, the three main centers of state capitalist industry. This is the liberal side of the international ruling class, basically, the group around Carter. In fact, he came out of that. He was picked out of that. His whole cabinet was part of it, and so on. So these are kind of the soft side, not the tough guys who run the world. And they were concerned about the crisis of democracy was that during the 1960s, in the three trilateral countries, the United States and Europe and Japan, there had been an increase of popular activism. The normally passive and apathetic population had begun to organize politically, young people and women and labor and all sorts of people, ethnic groups. They were all beginning to organize to press their demands, to put them in the political arena. And that's not democracy. That's a problem. That's a crisis of democracy. And what was recommended was more moderation in democracy. Return to passivity, apathy, obedience, because that's the only way democracy can function. Democracy is understood as a system in which small, privileged elites rule without the annoying population getting in their way. And if you can do that with sort of formal things like pushing buttons every once in a while, then it's democracy. But if there's ever a threat that the population might try to influence their own affairs, I won't even talk about managing their own affairs. That would be, by that point, to drop nuclear weapons. But just begin to influence what's happening with regard to their own lives and affairs. That's a crisis, and you've got to overcome it. That commitment is so profound, it's very hard to find exceptions to it. It's really pretty close to standard democratic theory. And it relates to the media. The media is just one part of it. The media are supposed to play this role, but the same is true of the schools and the universities and scholarship and the churches and the cinema and television, radio, whatever's around, are all supposed to be part of this system, ensuring apathy, obedience. As I said before, you'd be supposed to be a consumer atom, maximizing your own good, not caring about anybody else. Everything from sitcoms to the editorial pages gives you one or another form of it. And this is pretty much doctrine. It's not very secret. You can find out about it because it's talked about a lot. So, for example, if you pick almost at random, but an important figure, both in the media and in democratic theory, take Walter Lippmann, who was the, sort of dean of American journalism and also a leading commentator on democratic theory, and if you look at his collected essays, you'll notice they're described as a progressive theory of democracy, which they were. He was a progressive in the 20s and the 30s, and he lays it all out very clearly. He says, in a democracy, there are two categories of citizens. There's a small group who he calls the responsible men, or the specialized class, and their job is to analyze, evaluate, make decisions, implement the decisions, and so on. They're the ones who run everything. And then they're like maybe 10, 15%. And then there's another group, which he describes as the bewildered herd. And he says we have to protect ourselves from the trampling and the rage of the bewildered herd. He said, they're ignorant and meddling outsiders. Maybe 80-90% of the population are ignorant and meddling outsiders, and just for their own good, we have to protect ourselves from them so we can continue the job of running things in the public interest, because of course we're such good people. That's what we do. And there's these two categories, and therefore in a democracy there's two functions. He calls them. There's the responsible men, as they say, their function is to understand and make decisions and so on. The function of the meddling and ignorant outsiders is, he says, to be spectators of action, not participants. Exactly the same message as the Trilateral Commission. In fact, as I say, you can trace it back to 17th century libertarians like John Locke, who thought that people should not even be given the right to discuss public affairs. He's considered a leading figure of modern liberalism. When he wrote his Constitution, he was also a colonial civil servant, and he wrote the Constitution of the Carolines, in which it is made illegal to discuss public affairs. It's none of your business, You're meddling and ignorant outsiders, the responsible men do it. Now, Lippmann, there's a certain question that Lippmann doesn't ask, and it's important that it not be asked. He doesn't ask the question, how come I am a member of the responsible men? Why me? Why not, say, Eugene Debs or something, who was in jail at the time because he dared to speak his mind? So how come me and not Eugene Debs? That's a question that doesn't get raised. And it's an obvious question. It's interesting that it's not raised, and the answer is equally obvious. You can become a member of the responsible men and the specialized class if you are properly subservient to real power. Now, real power happens to lie elsewhere, and it's no big secret where it lies. It lies in the class that can control the decisions that matter in the society and that control the resources. In short, it resides in a corporate elite, which is closely interconnected with state power, and that state corporate nexus, that's power. You serve their interests, and you can make it to be one of the responsible men. You oppose their interests, and you're not one of the responsible men. You're out. You got to be marginalized in one fashion or another. Now, the question is so obvious that it takes real commitment not to raise it, and it also takes equal commitment on the part of the commentators on all this not to notice that nobody raised it. But that's part of indoctrination, too. For the commissar class, the class who pretends that, or maybe even believes, that they're making the decisions, but in fact is just allowed to do it as long as they serve other interests. For that class, it's very important not to understand those things. It's very important to have the illusion that you're there because you're so smart and so good and so much working in the public interest, namely the interests of corporations who have real power. Because if you start thinking about what you're really doing and why you're really getting there, first of all, you have some doubts about it, and secondly, you might let somebody else know it, and that would be bad, because one major task of the commissar class is to prevent anybody from seeing any of it. So in fact, an entry ticket to the commissar class, the responsible men, is that you not ask questions like that. You not look into the question of why are certain people in a decision-making position and why are others not there, or why is the structure of decision-making hierarchic and authoritarian instead of participatory. Just don't ask those questions. As soon as you ask those questions, they're already subversive, because you're moving towards too much insight into the way things really work. But if you sufficiently brainwashed yourself, sufficiently indoctrinated yourself, you're willing to serve powerful interests, then you can make it through. And that's true of just about every institution, whether it's universities or, newspapers or whatever. Now, there are exceptions. Like there's noise in the system, so it's not 100%. And as long as there's, and a system can tolerate that. Even totalitarian systems tolerate it. On the other hand, if it would go too far, then you get a crisis of democracy, you got to do something. And repeatedly there's something done, controlling the public mind being the main thing that has to be done in countries that are more free. The United States is in many respects the freest country in the world. There's been centuries of popular struggle which have reduced state power, the capacity of the state to coerce, at least for privileged sectors. And being the freest country in the world, it's not at all surprising that it should have the most sophisticated and elaborate indoctrination systems, and it does. The public relations industry alone probably spends over $1 billion a year in controlling the public mind on everything from beliefs to attitudes and values. I mean, the whole business. That's only a piece of it. The media are another piece. Well, sometimes the achievements are pretty spectacular. At this point, just go on into endless examples, but let me just mention one because it's current and rather striking. We just went through the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And there was a big flow of stuff in the media about whether the Japanese were showing enough guilt, had they apologized enough to us for bombing an American military base in a colony which we had stolen by violence and fraud from its population 50 years earlier. Well, admittedly, that's a kind of a crime, but, on the rank of crimes, that one's pretty low. So had they shown enough guilt for having done this thing to us, attacking an American military base on a colony. And there were, New York Times Magazine and everything else, big flow of stuff, big denunciation of the Japanese for not showing enough guilt to us. At the same time, right, and it's true, they should show guilt for that. I mean, they have a horrible record during the Second World War. This is nothing, I mean, this is absolutely nothing as compared to what they did, say, in Manchuria. But it's pretty hard for us to call for them to show guilt about that because the U.S. was supporting it. The U.S. didn't care much what they were doing in China, as long as they allowed us to get in the Act II. In fact, the big thing, what led to Pearl Harbor, was the Japanese refusal to allow the United States to enter into the China market that they were controlling. If they'd let us in, fine, race of Nanking, whatever you like, but just let us in there so we're not cut out of the business operations. In fact, the last meeting of the Japanese and American representatives before Pearl Harbor, there were the Hull-Nomura, Cordell Hull, Admiral Nomura negotiations. The Japanese actually agreed to the U.S. terms. They said they would open the China market to U.S. penetration if the U.S. would do the same thing in the Philippines and Cuba, which we had closed off to Japanese penetration. And Hull was absolutely outraged over this, as were all American commentators. What right do these little yellow bastards have to ask us to open up our imperial domain to their penetration? They're supposed to open up theirs to our penetration. That's called the open door. And so he refused with great outrage. In fact, you read Foreign Affairs and all these journals, everybody's extremely outraged over this. And that, led to war. Okay, so that's a crime, but somewhere down pretty low on the scale of crime. Now, it happens that period, you can't date it to the day, but just about November through January 1961 to 62, that is 30 years ago, so another anniversary, that was the date of the direct U.S. attack against South Vietnam. That was the time when John F. Kennedy, who was a really violent and aggressive figure, maybe even one of the most in modern American history, that's when he escalated the war against South Vietnam, which up till then had been kind of Central America-style death squad terror, maybe killing 80 or 90,000 people since 1954 when the U.S. took over from the French. He escalated that state terror war to direct U.S. aggression. That was the period when Kennedy authorized the U.S. Air Force to start directly bombing South Vietnam. Helicopters, U.S. planes started, and he also authorized U.S. advisors, so-called, to go into combat, also released napalm to the Saigon Army, a client army there. And that was so like 30 years ago right now in January, if you read, say, Kennedy's right-hand man on counterinsurgency, Roger Hilsman, who's another big liberal, he describes in his book how there was a tragic error in January 1962, so that's 30 years ago. The tragic error was that U.S. Air Force planes who were bombing South Vietnam by accident hit a village on the Cambodian side of the border and killed however many people. But then, fortunately, they saw their error, so they went back to the Vietnamese side and bombed the right village. But the bombing of the Cambodian village, that was a tragic error. And there were several thousand U.S. sorties flown through 62 by October 1962. The New York Times actually reported that 30% of the bombing flights were directly U.S. Air Force. The rest were the Saigon Air Force, which is just a client Air Force, basically U.S., but run by with mercenaries as they controlled. This was part of a big effort. It was part of Kennedy's effort to drive several million people, up to 7 million people, into concentration camps where they would be separated from or as they put it, protected from the guerrillas who everyone conceded they were willingly supporting. There's no question about that. And again, if you look back at Hilsman, he explains why the effort failed. He said, although we were able to drive them into these camps called strategic hamlets, we never figured out a way to prevent Viet Cong political activists from infiltrating. So we never managed to get the political activists out of there, and therefore we couldn't protect the people because they kept being subverted by, their cousin or their uncle or whoever the local National Liberation Front civilian was, and therefore the thing didn't work. We tried to protect the population, but we couldn't. At that same time, the U.S. set up what were called counter-terror squads, which were designed to kill National Liberation Front civilian officials. Remember, nobody doubted at that time, CIA or anybody else, that the South Vietnamese population was, for the most part, supporting the guerrillas, and virtually nobody supported the U.S. client regime. That was conceded on all sides. We set up counter-terror teams to assassinate Viet Cong civilians, National Liberation Front civilians. Why is that counter-terror? Well, because we're doing it. When we assassinate civilians, it's counter-terror. So therefore it's counter-terror. In fact, the New York Times, just to celebrate the anniversary in October 1961, had a review of a book on this by Alan Grant, in which that's the way they referred to them. This great program, 1962, counter-terror teams to assassinate civilians in South Vietnam, the country which we just then had escalated our attack from state terror of the Guatemalan style to direct aggression. And so it went on, the rest of the story. Well, that was not the attack on a military base in a colony that had just been stolen from its people. This was an attack on another country. This was an aggression against South Vietnam, which finally led to the slaughter of maybe 3 or 4 million people and the destruction of 3 countries. In fact, to this day, people are still dying from it. You bother to read, not the American press, the Canadian press, you can read reports from the militarized zone where, for example, there was a report a couple of weeks ago where some Canadian reporter was in a village there, a Montagnard village, and the people there were asking authorization to shoot down American helicopters coming by to look for MIAs. Why? Well, because that was a region that was absolutely devastated, turned into a complete moonscape by U.S. bombing. The bombing was so heavy that to this day, people are still dying from bombing. Children will walk out in the fields and see something and pick it up and it explodes and kills them. Thousands of them have been killed and they're being killed right till now. It's a period where it's an area where there's a very high number of cancers and deformed fetuses, because it was South Vietnam, remember, that was subjected to U.S. chemical warfare. There's very little of that in North Vietnam because we didn't use chemical warfare against the North, we used it against the South. So it's in the Saigon hospital that you see rows and rows of deformed fetuses up until today. Well, that's going on right till now. But notice that nobody raises the question about whether we have something to apologize about, because we don't. No, we don't. We're the victims. We're not responsible for this. They're responsible for it. In fact, Kennedy's ambassador at the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, another liberal hero, gave a talk at the United Nations at the time in which he condemned the South Vietnamese for what he called internal aggression. That was a concept that was made up by the Kennedy intellectuals. And internal aggression was aggression by the South Vietnamese people against American forces who were attacking them in their country. So that's the term that was used. Nobody batted an eyelash about it, notice. It was internal aggression. And so it went through the 60s. By 69, as I said, things were beginning to break up. Now, the popular movements had gotten big enough so people were seeing things were even seeping through the media. We go into another huge propaganda campaign to reverse all that. Now the barbarians are holding these, soldiers that they kidnapped to torture them and so on. And that goes right up till today. In fact, the way we celebrated the 30th anniversary of Kennedy's escalation of the war to direct aggression was by renewing the embargo against Vietnam. That's over the objections of almost everybody in the world, incidentally. Japan, Europe, everybody wants to drop that embargo, not because they're nice guys, but because they think they can make money that way. Good sections of American business want the embargo dropped, but the state, which represents the long-term interests of the corporate class, realizes that there's a deeper principle involved. The principle is to teach the lesson to the world that if people in the third world are not obedient, if they don't succumb to our power and violence, they have to be punished forever. They're never going to get out of it. It's not enough to have destroyed the countries. It's not enough to have murdered millions of people. We're going to make sure that they keep suffering and that everybody in the third world understands it. You don't step on our toes. We're the global enforcer. You succumb when we tell you to. If you don't, you're the aggressor, we're the victim, and we're going to punish you forever. All of this was recorded, goes on. Nobody sees anything funny about it. The fact that we celebrate this, that we're demanding that the Japanese apologize for their attack on an American military base in a colony that we recently conquered, but we don't apologize from murderous aggression for which half the leadership should be hanged by the standards of Nuremberg. We don't apologize for that. And we don't have to, because we're the victims. We're the victims, they're the bad guys. The only humanitarian issue that remains is the MIA. And you read article after article in the press, and you see movie after movie and television show after television show saying, well, if they'll only be more forthcoming on the MIAs, maybe we'll agree to talk to them. And this goes all the way across the culture. When Jimmy Carter, in 1977, was asked at a news conference about the U.S. punitive actions against Vietnam, he said that we owe the Vietnamese no debt because the destruction was mutual. Okay, all you have to do is, you walk in the streets of Raleigh and Vien or something, you can see right off that the destruction was mutual. Notice that Carter is on the liberal side of the spectrum, soft-hearted guy. The destruction was mutual, no debt. On the harsher side, it's not mutual. We're the ones who suffered the destruction. They're responsible. And until they expiate their guilt to us, we're not going to let them eat, or live. We're going to keep the stranglehold on them. And the U.S. is powerful enough so that if we keep the embargo, no international funds flow in, other investors won't invest, and so on. So we can make them suffer. Well, all of that's going on at the same time. And you tell me, I don't read the whole press, obviously, but I looked pretty hard to find who would notice this. I found three things. All of them come from a single source. Okay. In fact, it's three friends who talked about it. One of them was a column by Alex Coburn in the LA Times. He talked about it. One was an editorial in Z Magazine. A third was an op-ed in the Washington Post by a very distinguished Asia historian, Japan historian, John Dower, who was asked by the Post to submit a column on Japanese guilt, and he agreed to, he did, but he put in a line there about, that's not the whole story. There's the American attack on South Vietnam. He was killed. They didn't publish it. Maybe he didn't like the English or something. But those are the three things I know of. Now, maybe there's more. Like I imagine if you scout through the whole country, you'd probably find something more. But here is something just of overwhelming obviousness. No totalitarian state could come close to achieving this, I don't think. No totalitarian state in history could have achieved anything like this. Here it passes without comment. Nobody notices it. Everybody goes on to the next day's affairs. And that shows the brilliant achievement of brainwashing under freedom, the kind of indoctrination that is carried out without a club. And it makes sense. Precisely because the club isn't really readily available, it's necessary to have much more intensive indoctrination, whether it's the kind that just marginalizes people and makes them feel impotent and weak and so on, like, say, sitcoms or, agents of consumption or whatever, or whether it's drilling beliefs into their heads the way it's done in, academic studies and so on and so forth, or everyday newspapers. It's got to be constant, relentless, and ends up being effective. Well, you can give case after case of this sort. In fact, even discussing cases is misleading because it suggests that there's some, it suggests that some cases are different than others, and they aren't. I mean, I haven't seen a single case of any significance which isn't very much like this, exactly like it most of the time. This topic's been studied, it's one of the most extensively studied topics probably in these so-called fields, not much in the way of fields like the social sciences. It's been tested by, the harshest criteria anybody can think of. It's just overwhelming. There's just no doubt that the media live up to the condition that they must live up to, namely they are agents of subordination to state corporate power. And it's a little misleading to talk about the media because one studies them because they're more visible and easier to study. But if you look at, say, schools and textbooks and a good bit of scholarship, it's not all that different. I'm sure if you could get collections of sermons, it probably wouldn't be that much different. Although, churches have broken out of this to some extent. Now, last comment on this, and then we'll open up. Despite all this, the person who introduced me said something about how the media looked so homogeneous and coming out of the same, mold and so on. I think if you look over a longer stretch, that's not really true. And in my view, the media are more open now than they were 30 years ago. There's more dissidence, there's more criticism, there's more openings to alternative views. And in fact, they're somewhat more diverse, in my opinion, than they were in the past. Furthermore, there's by now a whole range of alternatives which didn't exist. So there are so-called alternative media, or what Jeff Tillman likes to call independent media, more accurately, which aren't part of the system of subordination. People can turn to those. So my opinion is, at least, if you look over, say, the last 30 years, there's been a degree of opening. I agree that the situation is pretty awful, in fact, horrifying, but it's better than it was. So you go back to, say, just take the time of the U.S. attack against South Vietnam, bombing of South Vietnam, there wasn't a peep of criticism. Nobody even noticed it, New York Times has a front-page story saying 30% of the bombing raids against South Vietnam are being carried out by the U.S. Air Force. People just go about their business applauding Camelot, It never occurred to anybody to think there's something funny about this, In fact, it was a noble effort. We're doing it. We're killing them, so it must be good. Kennedy's terrorist war against Cuba, which was far and away the most extensive exercise of international terrorism, certainly in history by that time, maybe still today. I mean, it's kind of like a semantic point whether you call the war against Nicaragua terrorism or outright aggression. But if you call it outright aggression, then this remains to this day by far the major act of international terrorism of all time, probably still continuing. A couple of days ago, the Cubans picked up 3 more people who landed in Cuba from Miami and who said at least that they were, planning some terrorist action and so on. The only response from the United States is, don't penalize them too hard. That wouldn't be fair. A little different than the way we react to Libyans we accuse of terrorism. If Cuba were to, say, bomb Washington, which would be what we regard as legitimate, like if we claim, without picking up anybody, that Libya was involved in a disco bombing in Germany without a particle of credible evidence, we're allowed to bomb Libya. And everybody, all the way over to, say, Anthony Lewis, hails us for our magnificence. Well, okay, Cuba just picked up 3 American terrorists a couple days ago. Why shouldn't they bomb Washington? That's what everybody should be saying. That's our standard. In fact, they should probably be nuking Washington to have much more evidence. What's more has been going on for 30 years. But that's not the case. Anyhow, things have changed. They have changed. It's not the way it was 30 years ago. Nowadays, you couldn't send the American Air Force out to carry out a third of the bombing raids against some other country, the other 2/3 being carried out by your client's force, without anybody caring. People would care, and in fact, the government can't do it. They're forced into clandestine wars, terrorist wars, very quick victories, before there's any chance for the public to respond, and so on. Those are all changes. They're changes that are due to the crisis of democracy, to the organizing and the pressure, and so on. And I think they've reflected the media too. There are some critical voices in the media that you didn't find 30 years ago. They are more responsive, and they can be a lot more if the pressures increase. I mean, things have changed over hundreds of years precisely because popular movements were not cowed and didn't subordinate themselves to, the responsible men, and didn't agree that their only function was to be spectators, and kept increasing this crisis of democracy. And if that goes on, things can change, and in fact the institutions also aren't graven in stone. It's possible to imagine a society in which really has libertarian social forms, in which there isn't a narrow concentration of resources and decision-making power, and therefore governance by a ruling group over the rest, and in which people really do participate in a meaningful way in managing their own affairs. And in such a society, the problem of ensuring obedience would simply not arise because there would be nobody to ensure it. That's a long-term goal, but history isn't over, I hope. Well, like I said, I was going to talk too long if I talked, so yeah. I think he's raised his hand first. Yeah. Luke, Lies of Our Time. I write for it, so you've got to qualify what I say by that. Lies of Our Times is a monthly journal devoted to basically exposing the lies of our time. My suspicion is that the original intended title was Lies of the Times, but probably their lawyers told them they couldn't get away with that. The lettering and so on is a replica of New York Times lettering, and it's concerned with the way events were reported or misreported or biases and so on in the past month. I think it's often quite good. I have to say, though, I have to say, I've written for it, my daughter writes for it, my friend edits it, you can't believe a word I say on this topic. I don't agree. Yeah, I don't agree. I've written about that. In fact, I think that demonstrates the subservience of the media. In fact, I think it's a dramatic example of it. Let's take a look at what happened. Okay, actually, history set up a controlled experiment for us in that case, something that rarely happens. The Watergate exposure, the information about Watergate came out almost to the month, exactly at the time of the exposure of Cointelpro. Cointelpro came out in court hearings and Freedom of Information Act things and so on. So here we had these two big exposures. One of them Watergate, one of them Cointelpro. Okay, now look what happened. Look what they were about. What was Watergate? What was Watergate about? Well, it's pretty hard to say. I mean, nothing happened at Watergate. What happened at Watergate was that a president sent a bunch of Keystone cops, comical crooks, to the Democratic headquarters to do something. Nobody knows what. To no purpose as far as anyone knows. And they screwed up because they forgot which side the door was or something, and they got caught. That was Watergate. I mean, completely meaningless, tiny little petty crookedness. There were a couple of other things, like, big denunciation of Nixon because he had this enemies list. Well, what happened to anybody in the enemies list? Actually, I can testify about that because I was on it. Nothing happened to anyone on the enemy's list. We didn't get our taxes audited. These are just guys that Nixon hated. Okay, so he hates somebody. Who cares? And so the fuss about the enemy's list wasn't because I was on it. It was because people like Thomas Watson, who head of IBM, and George Bundy, and guys like that were on it. Well, that was Watergate. They broke into a psychiatrist's office and tried to get things about the NL for a couple of really minor things like that. I mean, barely beyond the norm, in fact. Now, let's take Cointelpro. Okay, Cointelpro was a major operation which went on through at least 3 administrations. Kennedy, probably 4, because Eisenhower, I think, started. Eisenhower, Kennedy, picked up in Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. It was not carried out by a bunch of petty crooks organized for the occasion. It was carried out by the National Political Police, the FBI, right through all these administrations. What it did just dwarfed Watergate. I mean, just take one marginal incident in Cointelpro. For 13 years, the FBI had been burglarizing the headquarters of a legitimate legal political party, Socialist Workers' Party. They'd been burglarizing it, stealing its files, distributing the membership files to employers to try to prevent people from getting jobs, using information in other ways to disrupt and prevent the operation from functioning. Well, that's comparable. That's at least in the same domain as Watergate, interfering with a legal political party. But it's just orders of magnitude beyond it. Nixon didn't do anything like that to the Democratic Party. He just broke into his suite to look for something. And that was the least of, in the Cointelpro context, that was one of the least things. As I say, it went up to political assassination. It went up to direct FBI complicity in a political assassination, as Fred Hampton in Chicago, and Mark Clark. And it included violence and terror and disruption of political groups all over the country and so on. Well, in comparison to Cointelpro, Watergate isn't even a Tea Party. Nothing. But nevertheless, Watergate was exposed. Was a huge affair, big exposure, Pulitzer Prizes, everybody excited about the magnificence of the media and so on and so forth. Take us back and check the coverage of Cointelpro. It's virtually non-existent. In fact, just after this period, I happened to give a talk at this thing called the Nieman Fellows at Harvard, which is all kind of hotshot journalists from around the country. Come to Harvard for a year. And I gave a talk there. And just out of curiosity, I talked about this. And out of curiosity, I asked them, could anybody there tell me who Fred Hampton was? And one hand went up. The guy from Chicago. Guys murdered in Chicago. It was covered in the Chicago press. But nobody else could. All these, big Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, none of them ever heard of it. Okay, so the FBI was involved in the assassination of a Black Panther leader. Police break in at 4 o'clock in the morning, murder him in bed, probably drugs. That's the big deal. What's important is that Nixon called George Bundy bad names in private and didn't do anything about it. In fact, the difference between Watergate and Cointelpro is that Watergate was a triviality, attacking powerful people, and Cointelpro was a real atrocity, in fact a crime, attacking people without power. And that tells you exactly where the media are. The crime is to attack people with power. If you attack people with power, they'll fight back. You do bad things to people with power, they'll go right after you and get you. And that's what happened. They went after Nixon and they got him on a bum rap. What he did was, if you want to go after Nixon on something, go after him on the Hampton assassination or on the bombing of Cambodia, for example. It didn't come up. It didn't even come up in the hearing. It came up and was then dismissed. And in fact, the only way it came up was he hadn't notified Congress. So you want to bomb some other country and kill a couple 100,000 people? That's okay. Just tell us about it. Right? That was the issue. And then it never even came up in the final bill of independence. In my view, is the extreme character of the subservience to power on the part of the elite. And I think this pairing of events shows it pretty dramatically. There's actually a background to this. Lots of powerful groups had it in for Richard Nixon for some very important reasons. In 1971, as part of the reaction to the decline of the Vietnam War was turning out to be very harmful to the American economy and very beneficial to the economies of our rivals, Europe and Japan. And the United States could no longer sustain the post-war international economic system, the Bretton Woods system, which was based on the American dollar and convertibility of gold and that sort of thing. So Nixon broke it up. In 1971, Nixon dismantled the entire post-war economic system. He increased import duties. He introduced controls. He did lots of things that major sectors of American business didn't like one bit. You take a look at the Wall Street Journal after that, they were screaming. Powerful groups had it in for Richard Nixon, and they were waiting for a chance to do him in for things like this. Then when he made his one serious error, namely he called powerful people bad names in private, they had their opportunity and they went after him, and he was kicked out. In my view, a bum rap. I should say the one favorable mention I've ever gotten in the New York Times was about this. I wrote an article in which I said something approximately like this, and William Safire wrote a column thanking me for finally telling the truth about Watergate. And then I started getting letters from little old ladies in Ohio and so on. Thank you for standing up for our president in this time of adversity and so on. But essentially it was correct. And I think if you look at it in the context, the Watergate affair demonstrates the thesis. It doesn't undermine it. In fact, that's a pretty dramatic demonstration in my view. If you want a methodologically good test of the thesis, let the opponents of the thesis pick their own strongest ground. Let them pick the cases. You can always pick cases where it's okay, let them pick the cases. You want to show the press is adversarial, pick your favorite case. Okay? Well, Watergate's one of the favorite cases, and I think that very case shows the opposite. In fact, every case that's picked by the adversaries is the strongest ground, shows it in my view. I've been through every one of them.
Well, speaking of paradoxes, I think we've also got the so-called disintegration of the Soviet Union, the practices of taking on as fast product for
No, that's doubtful. I mean, I think we want to wait for that. I mean, it's very likely that it will go into highly authoritarian structures. That democratization is unlikely, and if it does go to democratization, the United States and the West are not going to like it. No, I don't think it's a paradox. See, and I'll talk about this tomorrow night, but in my view, the conflict with the Soviet Union is basically a North-South conflict. The Soviet Union was always part of the Third World. It tried to break out. It's now back in the Third World, and it's going to be treated that way. But notice that there's a very obvious question to be asked about this triumph of capitalism business. In fact, like 100% of the commentators, whether academic or, close to 100%, like I say, there's some noise in the system, but pretty close to 100%, talk about the catastrophe of Eastern Europe as demonstrating the superiority of capitalism over communism. Because look, just compare Eastern Europe and Western Europe and take a look at the difference. Oh, that's an absolutely idiotic comparison. That's an idea that couldn't occur to any person of limited sanity. I mean, you want a comparison of the Soviet Union to somebody, compare it with some country that was like the Soviet Union pre-1917. Like compare it to Brazil, If you want to say something about Eastern Europe, fine. Compare Bulgaria, which fell behind the Iron Curtain in 1945. Compare it, say, to Guatemala. Okay, which is kind of more or less like it. In fact, if you make the obvious comparison, compare countries that were more or less alike. Brazil, big, rich country, plenty of resources, no enemies, all that kind of stuff. Compare the wealthy countries that were more or less alike prior to so-called communism. There's about as much to communism in relation to communism as Guatemalan democracy as to democracy. But anyhow, let's call it that. Compare the societies that were alike before communism and the ones that remained in the domains of the capitalist West, and let's see what happened there. Well, that's a comparison. It doesn't occur to the comparison of Western and Eastern Europe is insane. Those two parts of the world weren't alike for 500 years, Eastern Europe was third world, deeply impoverished third world colonies of the West. Well, you make that comparison, which incidentally is pretty standard in third world countries where people are less brainwashed on these issues, and it's a pretty different story. You compare, say, Russia and Brazil, well, a lot of comparisons, but you don't get the same conclusion. Actually, I had a couple articles in G Magazine on this last year, and there's a chapter of it in a book of mine. But as far as I know, that's the only. There's a few other cases, but there's very few efforts to really compare the two in any realistic way. There's an article in the New Left Review in London that does it. And that would be the realistic comparison. Furthermore, if you want to talk about the triumph of capitalism, let's take a look at the countries that illustrate that triumph. Okay, so the last 10 years have been an absolute catastrophe for capitalism. The domains of the capitalist world have sunk into absolute catastrophe. Latin America, Asia, most of Asia, Africa, all the traditional colonial areas, which are basically run by the capitalist center, have suffered a huge catastrophe in the last 10 years, in fact even worse in Eastern Europe. But there are a few places that have escaped. Those are called the miracles of capitalism, like, say, South Korea. That's capitalism? I mean, that's fascism. That's not capitalism. It's a state-coordinated system where the state intervenes to get prices wrong, which was based on protection, extremely extensive protection. In Latin America, they have a problem with capital flow. There's a huge debt in Latin America, a huge capital flight, because it's open to international capital markets. It's capitalist. They don't have that problem in South Korea. You can get the death penalty for capital flight. No problem, In fact, this triumph of capitalism is, in fact, a demonstration that fascist-style structures work pretty efficiently, and they do. And we had our own experience with that. That's how we got out of the Depression. The Depression killed off the lingering belief that capitalism might be viable among any sectors of the business class. It was obviously not viable. What got the United States out of the Depression was a totalitarian economic system that was established during the Second World War. In fact, deeply totalitarian, more so than Nazi Germany. We really had a very disciplined society during the Second World War. Wage and price control, no strikes, no consumption, follow orders. It was done voluntarily, but nevertheless the structure was totalitarian. The economy was directed by the state, no individual initiative on the part of elements of private capital. It was run mostly by corporate managers. That was extremely successful. U.S. industrial production tripled or quadrupled, very high, because this is a very effective system. In fact, to this day, the sectors of our system that function are the ones that are state-coordinated. And that's pretty obvious when you think about it. Which parts of the U.S. economy are competitive internationally? Well, agriculture, which doesn't mean peasants, it means big agribusiness, which has gotten huge state subsidies, ranging from purchase of excess to ramming down American crops into the throats of people throughout the world through things like Food for Peace, for example, and other programs to develop export markets for the United States. That's one. But the main one is high-tech industry. It's state-coordinated, state-subsidized. High-tech industry is what runs thanks to the Pentagon. Pentagon pays Pentagon NASA, that whole system. That pays, it gets the taxpayer to pay the costs of research and development. It provides a state-guaranteed market for waste production, completely protected, nobody else can get in, and it works. That's the triumph of capitalism at home. That takes, say, Germany, very effective, successful capitalist country. The OECD, the Organization of Developed Countries, the economic organization, they did a study of the various German devices that are used to subsidize domestic industry and protect it and so on, and estimated they come to about a 30% tariff. Japan, we don't even have to talk about. The economy is coordinated by an interaction of the state authorities and industrial financial conglomerates. These are the things that succeed. The societies that have moved towards some kind of capitalism, the ones that accept IMF structural adjustments, free markets and things, they're a disaster. They collapse into, they disappear. In fact, it's even happening in Eastern Europe now. Poland tried it, economy disappeared. But they're not interested in democratic movements there either. There's no paradox. Democratic movements are always dangerous. Yeah? for exactly the reasons. I mean, it's not all that different from the fact that the United States supported Saddam Hussein when he crushed the Shiite and Kurdish rebellions. Democratic movements are dangerous. You've got to crush them. Well, that I'm not so convinced about. That I'm not convinced about because, in my view at least, the situation domestically is more complex. The popular movements exist, and I think they've expanded the domain of freedom. Now, there's certainly efforts to overcome the crisis of democracy, but, the fact that powerful groups try to achieve something doesn't mean that they succeed. Power isn't omnipotent.
What do you think, what is it that you think that would make people who are in a position welcome diversity?
Nothing. I mean, that's like, it doesn't make any sense. It's a question that doesn't make any sense. It's like asking what would make the chairman of the board of General Motors decide not to pursue maximizing profits and market share. Impossible. It's a logical impossibility. If the board of directors of General Motors decided not to pursue that, he would not be director of the board, chairman of the board of General Motors. General Motors is an institution in an institutional matrix, and in that institutional matrix, you have with very narrow limits, you must maximize profits and market share. If you don't do it, you're out, and somebody else is in who does do it. If somebody in the elites decides, I don't want power, I want diversity, that's fine. He can go out and become a taxi driver, and somebody else will move into the elite who doesn't agree. But those are not the right questions to ask. It's like asking, what could convince the dictator of the country to cede power to the population? Answer, nothing. I mean, the only thing that can convince him is enough pressure so he can't control the place anymore. That might convince him. Not talking to him. In fact, if he did cede power, somebody else would come in and do it. Well, it turns in plenty of profit. If it didn't turn in a profit, he wouldn't be making $4 million. In fact, if General Motors were not serving the interests of its stockholders, its stock would go down, there would be a hostile takeover, and you would have someone who does serve those interests. It may not be serving the public interest, but what's that got to do with anything? It's trying to maximize profit and market share within the framework available, and it's doing that pretty much. Among the options available to it, which of course remember, it may be harming the American economy, but the American economy is not an entity that functions in world affairs. That's propaganda, like the national interest and other forms of mysticism. If you're a corporation executive, you have some concern for the United States, but ask yourself what it is. Suppose you're a rich corporation executive, you live in some place in Connecticut. What do you care about? What about this country interests you? Okay, what interests you is that you have a safe and secure environment, no drug sellers show up on your golf course, your kids can go to fancy schools, you have 3 stretch limousines that you get from Germany or something because the American ones don't work. You have to have a big army. The country has to have a big army, so if anybody raises their head, you can go smash them up. You have to be able to have cheap labor, but it doesn't have to be here. It can be in Papua New Guinea. Capital moves all over the place. You can have your executive office in Zurich. You don't even care if downtown New York functions. You certainly don't care what happens in Harlem. That makes no difference to you at all. You would never see Harlem. Like I live in a suburb of Boston. How often do I see the slums in downtown Boston? My kids never saw them. I only see them if I happen to be using a talk down in Roxbury Community College. I mean, if you're part of the wealthy elite, what happens in most of the countries is actually no concern to you. I mean, maybe you happen to be a nice guy on the side. That's kind of irrelevant. Like you might take part of your $4 million and your millions of dollars and other kinds of income and decide to give some of it to charity. Okay, maybe you do, because you're a nice guy. But in your institutional function, you have no interest other than preserving a certain system of power and security. And what happens to the rest of the country is none of your business. And if you start worrying about it, you'll be out, because your stockholders aren't paying you to do that. Your stockholders are not paying you to make this a nice country. They're paying you so that you can increase their income. You start using your resources to make it a nice country, you'll be out in your ears.
Yeah, I'd like to discuss the current decisions of the campaign to make it clear to the American public that nuclear energy is really needed, especially in the aftermath of the Gulf War.
I would imagine that that'll continue, and this may surprise you, but in my view, that's a mixed story. See, what you have to ask about nuclear energy in my view is not a moral issue. It's a technical issue. It's one of the reasons I've never really been involved much personally in the nuclear energy campaigns. Nuclear weapons are a moral issue. Nuclear energy is a different issue. You have to ask about relative costs of alternatives. Now, the best thing around would be conservation and, alternative energy sources and so on. That's the best thing. Right now, we're not in a position to move toward the best thing. I wish we were, but we're not. So you ask, what about the next best thing? Well, suppose the choice is between increasing fossil fuels and increasing nuclear energy. Suppose you face that choice. At that point, it's not obvious what the right answer is. That's very tricky, in fact. And I think these are not such simple questions. But nuclear energy is not functioning now because it's just hopelessly overexpensive. That's why it's not working. And if the corporations can get the public to subsidize the costs, that'll make it competitive. But the same is true of fossil fuels. You've got to get the public to subsidize the costs. Well, we're not strong enough. I mean, right now, just the objective fact is we're not strong enough. I wish we were. We could become strong enough. But suppose that, you would like to be strong, you would like to have powerful enough popular movements to achieve some end. Okay. Suppose you look and you see, look, we can't do that right now. We've got to make choices at a lower level of desirability. And we must, because those choices have to be made. Well, then you have to ask, how do I make those decisions? Those are the decisions of real life. Real life does not choose between the ideal that you would like to have and, nothing. Those are not the choices in your personal life or in your life as a political activist. Your choices are always much more murky. Only if there's radical institutional change. Not now. We're not at a stage where there can be radical institutional change. You might like it, like I would like it, but I also live in this world, not in some dream world.
You said that in the last 30 years it is better than 30 years ago. But how do you, where do you put the press, media, the TV, and all the American intellectual and academic life that was involved during the war against Iran? How can you say that it is better when the media can raise almost a fascist atmosphere in the United States?
It's much better, because notice what happened. What happened is that during a 2 or 3 month period, the media did exactly what you said, and the intellectuals went along exactly as you said. And now let's ask what happened 30 years ago. Well, what happened 30 years ago, it didn't happen for 2 months. It happened for about 8 years. Okay? The U.S. attack against first of all, prior to Kennedy's attack against South Vietnam, we'd already conducted about 7 years of state terrorism in South Vietnam, which was very violent and murderous. Before that, we'd spent a couple of years supporting the French trying to reconquer their former colony. That was murderous. We then went on till the late 60s, attacking South Vietnam. We had hundreds of thousands of troops rampaging. We were killing millions of people. no protest. That's the difference.
Doesn't it scare you that in a short period of time, a president can mobilize the whole society, almost like Buddha Corona?
But what scared me much more was being alive in the 60s, when a series of presidents did it for 15 years before there was any protest. That's a lot more scary. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying you've got to put it in its. Well, I'm not saying things are nice. I'm saying they're better. And in fact, the government understands this very well. One of the most interesting things that happened during the Gulf War was a leak, which wasn't noticed very much, though it should have been. This is extremely important. There was a leak of a section from a national strategic planning document of the CIA and the Pentagon, the DIA, from the early days of the Bush administration. Right at the beginning of the administration, there's a big planning session of CIA and Pentagon, and they try to sort of assess the world situation. Every president does this. Usually it doesn't come out for like 30 years, if ever. But this one leaked. It leaked right, in fact, on the day of the opening of the ground combat. A section of it leaked. And here's what it said. It said, in the case of where the U.S. faces a threat from the third world, here's what we have to do. And it said, when the U.S. confronts a much weaker enemy, meaning anybody in the third world, anybody you're willing to fight, anybody you can't shoot back, the only time you're willing to fight, when the U.S. confronts a much weaker enemy, we must not only defeat them, but we must defeat them rapidly and decisively, because anything else will undercut political support. Now that's very perceptive. And that's exactly, I think that what that reveals is the government understands very well exactly what I'm saying. 30 years ago, you didn't have to defeat third world threats, much weaker enemies, rapidly and decisively. You could take years murdering and massacring them if you wanted to, because nobody cared. Now, if you don't do it rapidly and decisively, you're going to undercut political support. And that means the options for violence are very much narrowed. In fact, they're really narrowed to two categories. We saw that right through the 80s. Reagan's policies were very much like Kennedy's policies. Very much, if you look. Huge build-up of the military system, increase in international terrorism, more aggressiveness, even the regressive fiscal measures, the whole business. Very similar. Kennedy was able to move directly towards escalation of terrorism against Cuba and invasion of South Vietnam. And there was no constraint on that. Virtually no constraint. Little marginal concern that maybe ultimately the public would get upset, but basically nothing. Reagan tried the same thing. You recall, in February 1981, the Reagan administration, Reagan himself didn't know what was going on, but the guys in the administration came out with a white paper which was modeled on the Kennedy-Johnson white paper, except this was oriented towards Central America. Communists are conquering Central America and the Russians are taking it over and they're going to have us by the throat and so on and so forth. That was a preliminary to saying, okay, we got to move in. B-52s, Marines, the whole shebang. What happened? Well, what happened is the media went along completely. Big enthusiasm about the white paper. Yeah, communists taking over Central America, marching on Texas. You look back to then, not a question. But there was a big public reaction. It came from the churches, which by then had changed a lot from the 60s, and from other sectors of society. There was a big public reaction, demonstrations, protests, letters to Washington, people screaming at their senators, the whole thing, and at the newspapers. The administration backed off because they thought it was going to threaten programs that were more important to them, like the program of shifting resources to the wealthy and building up the state sector and, increasing the public subsidy to high-tech industry and all that stuff. And that was really important, much more so than killing a lot of people in Nicaragua. So they basically dropped it. After they dropped it, the media started criticizing the white paper. So in June, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, never the New York Times, had critical comments on the white paper, tearing it to shreds because of a collection of lies, the way the things always are. But that was after the public reaction, which had itself forced the administration to back down and had gotten the administration to tell the media to call off the campaign, in fact, publicly. They started saying, well, not so bad in Central America, don't get too excited about it. In other words, call it off. It's not going to work. Well, what the administration then did was move to clandestine terror. They didn't send the B-52s, they didn't send the Marines. They organized a secret terrorist army. They organized the biggest international, the most complex international terrorist campaign in history. I mean, you look at the structure of the war against Nicaragua. I mean, other countries hire terrorists, Carlos or somebody. We hire terrorist states. There's a big network of terrorist states organized. We're big boys. We don't sit around. So, Taiwan and Israel and Saudi Arabia and Brunei and, England. I mean, everybody was involved in it. It was a big war, terrorist states carrying out clandestine terror against Nicaragua. In El Salvador, the U.S. couldn't move in directly. It simply had to indirectly support death squads and killers and murderers and the Atacama Battalion and so on for their war against the church and everybody else. Same in Guatemala. They could not intervene directly. They had to get Israel and Taiwan to do it for them. Terrorist states, but couldn't do it directly. Well, the net effect of all of that was pretty bad. I mean, Central America suffered a brutal battering, maybe terminal even. But B-52s and Marines would have been a lot worse. And that's taught a lesson, and that's because things have changed. What's more, the scholarly profession was quite different. In the 1960s, the Asia scholarship was super hawkish. I mean, barely a critical word. If they weren't working for the CIA, they were presenting the propaganda. That went all the way over to people like John Fairbanks and others who considered on the left. That was very different in the 80s. The Latin American profession as a body just wouldn't go along. Right here you have a very good Latin Americanist who was a critical example, Schultz. They just didn't go along. In fact, he has a recent book in which he pointed that out, that the Latin American profession just would not go along. Very interesting how the media reacted. There's a technique in the media called objectivity. Objectivity means you don't express your own opinion. You pick somebody who has your opinion and you get him to express it. So if you look at cover, and this everybody understands incidentally, it's not a big secret. If you look at coverage of, take a look at coverage of the so-called peace process in the Middle East, this business, and you'll notice that virtually, like Thomas Friedman or any of these guys, who do they go to for comments? They go to something called the Washington Institute of Near East Policy, which is just an Israeli front. Everybody knows that. There isn't a single scholar there of any independent anything. They're just, I don't know if they're paid by the Mossad, but they're just, it's just an Israeli government front. So you go to them, and they make their comments, and you say senior associate of the Washington Institute, and that's the way you express your opinion objectively. Well, during the Vietnam War, you could go to the Asia scholars, and then they'd give your opinion objectively. But in the 80s, you couldn't go to the Latin American scholars. They didn't go along. They refused. They said, yeah, there was an election in Nicaragua, and, El Salvador's a bunch of gangsters, and they gave all the wrong answers. So what did the media do? Well, it was interesting. They invented a new cadre of experts. Literally. From the New York Review of Books over to, the Washington Post and the New York Times and everyone else, they invented a new cadre of experts. And it was interesting to see who they picked. Actually, one of the guys, an old friend of mine, a guy named Robert Lakin, became one of the leading experts. Robert Lakin was taught at MIT, taught French literature at MIT in the 60s. He was sort of sitting in his room studying something or other. Around 1970, he suddenly got involved in the peace movement, one of these very latecomers, And now he has a whole story about he was a big peace movement activist and so on. He was one of the last people involved. Like a lot of people who came in late and had no contact with anything, he went way off to the fringe extremist. He became a Maoist, Maoist maniac. In fact, he quit and he went off to Mexico, where he spent about 10 years writing absolutely insane articles about how, the guerrillas in the hills in Mexico, following the leaders of laws of Chairman Mao, were going to overdo this and that and the other thing. And he had friends who tried to help him out and that sort of thing. This nice guy. And that went on through the 70s. It went on up till 1979. Last time I saw him, he was chairing a pro-Pol Pot meeting. Then he disappeared for about 6. He didn't have a single article, no credentials, he was a smart guy, quite a smart guy, no fool. He disappeared for about 6 months. Then he showed up senior associate of the Carnegie Institution, testifying before Congress, wearing a tie, writing books, writing articles for the New York Review of Books, quoted in all the papers. If you look closely at what he was saying, it was the same Maoist baloney, except it was now the Contras who were the hardy peasants fighting against hegemonism, code word for the Russians. He just switched the thing around a little bit. I don't know if the media was too stupid to understand it, and the Congress people and so on, or if they understood it and didn't care. But the point is there's a connection. Maoism and Reaganism are almost identical, The primary contradiction, I don't know how many of you know this crazy lunatic rhetoric, but there's a primary contradiction and there's secondary contradiction. The primary contradiction is with the hegemonists, the Russians. And then there's secondary contradictions. We focus on the primary contradiction. And then there's the sturdy peasants, who understand the primary contradiction. So you read Lacan's so-called scholarly work, that's what it is. You read his articles in the New York Review, that's what it is. I can't believe that the editors of the New York Review didn't understand it. It was like a joke, But it worked, and then the media had their experts. In fact, the New York Times would give what they'd call a spectrum of opinion, expert opinion. It would go from Robert Lacan on the left, to Mark Falcoff on the right. He's another invented scholar of the American Enterprise Institute. And that's the spectrum. But it left out the whole Latin American Association. They weren't experts anymore because they were saying the wrong thing. Well, that's an indication of the same thing I'm saying. The fact that the Latin American Association simply wouldn't go along is another reflection of the successes of the movements of the 60s. And you see its effects everywhere. So yeah, things are bad, but they're a lot better. I mean, it's a lot better when state violence is restricted to clandestine warfare and rapid, decisive attacks against, done so fast that you don't worry about losing political support against an enemy who you first demonized by a huge propaganda campaign.
Is it also that the popular movement, the only thing that is achieved is made the state terror more expedient?
I don't think it's more expedient. I don't agree with you. I absolutely don't agree. I think it's much more expedient to use B-52s and Marines. And if you don't think so, ask the peasants of South Vietnam. I mentioned before a village in the demilitarized zone. Ask them what it's like to sit under B-52 bombing for 3 or 4 years. Yeah, it's a big difference.
I'm very curious about all the shock and outrage that so many commentators are treating Oliver Stone with right now. He's simply suggesting that Kennedy might have been a victim of a conspiracy. Why are the commentators so shocked about this?
Well, first of all, the commentary's been pretty mixed. The reason, he's after all charging not just a simple conspiracy. He's charging that Lyndon Johnson, president, and the major sectors of power were involved in a decision to kill this God figure, our father leader, as Kevin Costner calls him, who was going to lead, us to this glorious day. And if you look at the media commentary, it's quite mixed. It depends who you're talking about. Take a look at Arthur Schlesinger in the Wall Street Journal, for example. Arthur Schlesinger was, a political hack for the Kennedy administration. His job was to glorify Camelot. He was one of the scholars, and that's what he did. So he gives a rather nuanced critique of the film. He says, well, yeah, there's a case to be made that Kennedy was going to do all these magnificent things, but he kind of goes overboard, it wasn't that kind of conspiracy. And others play the game differently. But I frankly think the reaction to that should be quite different. The only commentary I saw that I really agreed with, and I have to admit we had discussed it in advance, was Alex Sobin's. Whatever happened in the Kennedy assassination, I don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know, but to quote Coburn's line, its political significance was about as great as if Kennedy had tripped over one of Caroline's toys and broken his neck. I don't think there's any more political significance than that. Well, the October Surprise is an interesting case. It takes a Gary Six book, which is to date, I think, the most substantial. And it has very interesting things in it. I would really advise people to read it. In fact, some of the things that Gary Six says, and which don't get controverted, nobody criticizes them even, are pretty astonishing. Doesn't even do the October surprise. What he says, for example, and he just states it flat out, and gives evidence for it, and nobody questions it, is that the Reagan guys, just before election, had an intelligence operation running, subverting the U.S. government from inside, and had it even extended to the point, according to him, of exposing an intended military action. Well, that's high treason. The kind of thing you hang people for. That's right. And nobody's paying any attention to it. That part of what Gary Sick says, nobody even bothers to refute, and nobody pays any attention to, like most important things. The thing that they're paying attention to is something which, in my opinion, is not very important. And that's why they're paying attention to it. The thing that they're paying attention to is the question whether, Casey was in Madrid and made a deal with some guy to get Khomeini to hold off on the hostages. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. If he did, it would again be like falling on Caroline's toys. I mean, Khomeini was going to withhold the hostages anyway. Khomeini had every reason to try to deal with the Reaganites and not Carter. For the same kind of reason why Reagan and Bush wanted to deal with Saddam Hussein. These guys recognize each other. They're the ones who, they're our kind of guys. Dealing with Carter is a bit of a pain in the neck. I mean, it's true that he does all the rotten things and everything, but then on the other hand, there'll be a little moralizing, and he talks about human rights and it's a damn nuisance. You're not going to get that from the Reagan people. Very straight killers. Those are the kind you want to deal with. So there was every reason for Khomeini to delay release of the hostages, whether the Reagan people asked for it or not. So I doubt very much that it had, maybe it happened. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot. There's interesting circumstantial evidence. Which one? Yes, I read that. Yeah, let me comment on that in a minute. But before coming back, let's see, what's supposed to be the deep political, I mean, if the idea is, the Reagan guys did something to steal an election, I mean, that's as important as you think the integrity of elections is. I don't think that's very high. And, if something was done to steal one, yeah, that's what everybody does all the time. How'd Kennedy get in? They probably ripped off a lot of votes in Chicago or something. But, but I think there is something really significant there. Like that, if it is really true, as Sick claims, and he does give evidence, and it's interesting that nobody comments, that the Reagan people were running an internal intelligence operation to subvert the U.S. government, and that it even went as far as undermining a planned military action, that's high treason of the kind that there has been no instance of in the history of this country. And it's interesting that nobody cares. Nobody's paying any attention to that part of it, which again makes me suspect it's probably true and real and important. On the other hand, what's supposed to be the significance of it? Well, what's supposed to be the significance, and this will get into the next question, is that it's supposed to explain why the U.S. sent arms to Iran, but it doesn't explain that. Now, let's buy the whole story. Suppose we accept everybody's story, except Barbara Hanover's story or any version of it you like. We still have a following embarrassing question. The hostages were released 5 minutes after Reagan's oath. Why did the U.S. send arms to Iran? I mean, is it because these Reagan guys are so honest, like they promised they were going to do it, so therefore they have to do it? That's a joke. I mean, are they afraid Khomeini's going to blackmail them? Khomeini's going to say, hey, you promised to send the arms and you didn't do it. I mean, it'd be the world laughing stock. In fact, the thing that it's supposed to explain, it doesn't even come close to explaining. We're left exactly as we were with the sale of arms to Iran. Furthermore, just to finish the story off, we know perfectly well why the U.S. sent arms to Iran through Israel, and we knew it back in 1982. In fact, I have a book in 1983 that talks about it from the public record, with careful explanations by the highest level Israeli authorities, who later surfaced in the Iran-Contra hearing, Nimrodi and Uri Lubrani and David Kimchi, deputy chief of Mossad and so on. They told us exactly what it was. They said the U.S. is sending arms to Iran via Israel for the usual purpose. The usual purpose is if you're trying to overthrow a civilian government, you send arms to the military. You want to overthrow a civilian government, who's going to overthrow them? I mean, Mother Teresa? No. People who are going to overthrow them are some colonel, And you get a bunch of gangsters together in the military, maybe they'll overthrow the government. In fact, Uri Lubrani, who's one of the top Israeli officials, puts it very straight on British television, nothing secret, BBC, 8-hour-long program on BBC. He says, we were looking, if we could find somebody in the Iranian military who'd be willing to shoot down 10,000 people in the street, we could overthrow the government. It's the kind of guy we're looking for. Well, how do you find people like that? Well, you send arms, you give military advisors. It's absolutely routine. That's how we overthrew the government of Chile. That's how we overthrew the government in Indonesia. I mean, it's just routine. You want to, it's like, it's not even an issue. You want to overthrow a civilian government, you try to establish contact with elements in the military who'll do it for you. And one of the ways you do that is by giving them goodies, like arms. Also, the U.S. had a secondary interest. The U.S. was supporting arms sales to Iraq and arms sales to Iran because it wanted them to kill each other. That's good for the U.S. and its allies. All those guys murder each other off. So the U.S. was playing both sides on that one. And those were perfectly good reasons. They were clear in 1982. There were no hostages then, incidentally. There wasn't any issue about hostage release. There weren't any. And it just continued. So that's probably the answer. There's every reason to believe that that's the answer. And that has nothing to do with the October surprise. Now, of course, like the intelligence operation inside the Pentagon and the high treason, that's important. And therefore nobody will talk about it. But anything that's important, you can be sure nobody's going to talk about. So, for example, you take a look at the Iran-Contra hearings, and if you'll notice, they begin in 1985. There's nothing, you take a look at the whole record of the Iran-Contra hearing, and they don't ask the journalists and everybody else, they don't ask the most obvious questions. Okay, let's say that from 1985 the U.S. was running a arms for hostages deal, let's say. What was the U.S. doing before there were any hostages? Answer, sending arms to Iran via Israel. Exactly the same thing. Okay, that throws that story out the window. And then we have to ask the question, well, what's the reason for it? And then we get back into normal operating procedures. You want to overthrow a civilian government? Arm the military. Okay? And apparently that's all that was going on. So I think the October surprise has a lot of interesting things associated with it, but not the things that are being focused. Sy Hersh's book, actually there were two books that came out around the same time. Andrew and Leslie Coburn have a book called Dangerous Liaison, and Seymour Hersh has a book called Samson Option, and they cover partially the same ground. In my view, the Coburn book goes a lot deeper into the important things. Hersh is a good journalist, good investigator, has information, a lot of details there about how the U.S. involvement in the Israeli nuclear arms system works. And that's probably worth knowing. I honestly didn't learn a lot from it. Except for some details. Yeah. Yeah, but we've known that for 20 years. We've known that for 20 years.
And so, I guess, one way to be, such a racist attitude that...
No, it's not racist. I don't think so. It's not. It's double standard, but I don't think it's racist. I mean, what it has to do with is who's the U.S. client. Remember, the U.S. was quite happy to help build up Saddam Hussein's nuclear industry up until August 2nd, 1990. He was the same guy. His worst crimes were already committed. The Bush administration was intervening repeatedly, even to block censure of his atrocious human rights record. In November 1990, the Bush administration authorized, I think it was about $1 billion of sales and loans. On the day of the Panama invasion, they picked the date of the Panama invasion, they stopped screaming about their love of human rights to announce that we're authorizing new credits to Iraq and China, incidentally. Okay. That's while we're going after Noriega, because of course we're concerned about human rights. I mean, by comparison with Saddam Hussein and the Chinese leadership, Noriega looks like Mother Teresa, and that was the day of it. It went right on until August 1st. The White House was still authorizing on high-tech double use, meaning essentially military arms sales to Iraq. Some of them were going directly to Iraqi nuclear industries, which were later bombed. That was up till the day. In fact, if the U.S. had wanted to deal with the Iraqi nuclear threat, which it probably was ambivalent about, didn't just want to support it, there was an easy way to proceed. In mid-April 1990, Saddam Hussein had actually made a proposal. The proposal was that all weapons of mass destruction in the region be destroyed. That was made to a group of U.S. senators who brought it back. Remember, Saddam Hussein was George Bush's good friend at that time, so he got an answer. He got an answer from the State Department. Richard Boucher, the State Department spokesman, said, we welcome Iraq, something like this, we welcome Iraq's offer to destroy its weapons of mass destruction, but we don't want this tied to other issues or weapon systems. Now that's an oblique way of saying, don't touch Israeli nuclear weapons. Nobody in the government, you'll notice, ever allows the phrase Israeli nuclear weapons to escape from their mouths. And there's a reason for that. In 1977, the Senate passed the Symington Amendment to the Foreign Aid Act, which bars any aid of a very broad category to any state involved in any fashion in transport or development or one thing or another of nuclear weapons, which would presumably include Israel. I mean, the lawyers could probably weasel out of it because the amendment was written in such a way as to kind of grandfather Israel in. It said, indicated new things, and they've been doing it for years. But the intent of the amendment plainly was to bar aid to states involved in nuclear proliferation, and that stands on the books. And if you start mentioning Israeli nuclear weapons, you have to ask the question, how come all the aid to them hasn't been illegal for the last 15 years? So nobody talks about it. It was therefore just other weapon systems. But if the U.S. had been interested in stopping the Iraqi nuclear weapons development, that was the time to move. Incidentally, on this Iraqi nuclear weapons development, I would really advise caution. I mean, there's an open question. I don't think it's settled. Saddam Hussein is beyond anything, as he was before. But that still leaves open a factual question. What about the Iraqi nuclear weapons program? Now, the stuff in the United States is mostly hysteria. If you want some analysis, you've got to go somewhere else. And there is analysis. There's a very good nuclear physicist who's a specialist on nuclear proliferation at Sussex University in England, Norman Chomsky, who had a very detailed analysis of this, one of the few I've seen in the London Review of Books, which is a serious journal, in which he said his conclusions, it's worth reading, his conclusions basically were that what has been discovered about the Iraqi nuclear program shows that the earlier predictions were pretty much on target. And he quotes the earlier assessments and what they predicted and what was found. He also says that it's true that there were Iraqi infractions of the international conventions. No. Nor can you expect Algeria, nor can you expect Pakistan, nor can you expect anyone else. Well, the entire region needs disarming if you want peace. But that's like talking about General Motors cutting back profits. Who wants peace?
I never heard anybody talking about the Christian bomb or Buddhist bomb or...
They didn't talk about an Iraqi bomb either, as long as... Yeah, they didn't talk... Sure, because Pakistan's not under control. In fact, they're not talking much about a Pakistan bomb, you'll notice, because Pakistan is a friend. It's not... Well, how about Turkey? Turkey's Islamic. Does anybody care if Turkey... During the Gulf War, Turkey was carrying out extensive bombing against the Kurdish population in southeastern Turkey, with hundreds of thousands of peasants, of people fleeing up into the hills and dying and so on and so forth. That was fine. Turkey was, a protector of peace and a guardian of human rights. Or take, say, Saudi Arabian elite. Or take the Emir of Kuwait. Look, anybody who follows orders is fine. That's the criterion. Race has almost nothing to do with it. I mean, it's a secondary factor, I agree. But it's a very secondary factor. If the Arab leadership in the Gulf has a task, their task is to be what the British imperialists used to call an Arab facade. You go back to Lord Curzon and those guys back in the 1920s. They said, it's too expensive to run the oil-producing countries as colonies. We can't do it anymore. What we need is an Arab facade, which will enable us to disguise absorption of the colonies behind the pretense, behind the veil of terms like buffer state and, a bunch of other terms. But basically they have to be colonies absorbed under an Arab facade. Well, you need an Arab facade to run them. And that's what the family dictatorships are for. The family dictatorships are kept in power because they manage the oil system in the interests of the West, the United States and Britain and so on. If they ever stepped out of line, they'd be dead in 3 seconds. And that's what happened to Saddam Hussein. He stepped out of line. But yeah, it's there, but it's secondary. It's just, look, the king of the Emir of Kuwait and the king of Saudi Arabia are just as much Arabs as, yeah. That's right, and it can be used any way you like. For example, if the Bush administration decides that Israel's getting in their way and they want to get rid of it, they can stir up anti-Semitism in 3 minutes. Okay, and then, in fact, there's no, take a look at last October, whenever this fuss was about the Israeli lobby made a big mistake. They thought they had some power. They don't understand the way politics works in the United States. Popular lobbies don't have any power unless they line up with some sector of real power. Then you got power. The only exception to that is the business lobbies, but then they're just lobbying their own representatives in the government, so that's a different story. But lobbies that have any kind of a public base, like the Israeli lobby, they can be powerful if there's some major sector in the state-corporate nexus that they're backing. Well, the Israeli lobby made the mistake of opposing a unified position. And the U.S. government had very good reasons to want to drive home this completely fraudulent Madrid conference, very good for U.S. interests and for the administration's parochial interests, and they weren't going to sacrifice it just because a couple of maniacs wanted some new settlements tomorrow instead of 4 months from now. So the Israeli lobby, therefore, faced a unified opposition and it collapsed. Went home. How did George Bush do it? He raised his eyebrow. He made one statement about, I'm just one little guy and these guys are pushing me around, implications, Jewish plutocrats and so on. And the whole thing came out. It's like 1 inch below the surface anyway. You want to have anti-Irish racism, you can get that started.
Ordinary people don't have time to really carry out the information. It's a full-time job.
Yeah. Well, I like Jeff Cohen's phrase, these independent media, which are just not just working for subordinated to state corporate interests, they have tremendous significance. Places that have community radio, for example, you just sense the difference in the community. And the rest, there's by now a big proliferation of alternative media. They, of course, almost by definition, they lack resources because they're confronting power, not serving it, so naturally lack resources. They can grow to the extent that popular democratic movements grow, which will support them. So it's like an interaction there. They help develop them and they can live on them. And they're extremely important. They provide other ways of looking at the world that you're not going to get from, New York Times or NPR and the rest of it. Yeah, I think so. You didn't have this network 30 years ago. There were some things 30 years ago, like there was Liberation, which was a pacifist journal. And there was Ramparts, which came out of a sector of the peace movement, but there wasn't much. I think it's just incomparably more. I don't even think it's a question. I've been running around the country giving talks for 30 years, constantly. And the reaction of the audience is totally different. Everywhere in the country. Now you don't have to bother giving talks just at Wisconsin and, Madison and some place like that. In fact, I usually don't even go to such places. Like right through the Gulf War. I and the two other people who do it, like Howard Zinn and Alex Coburn, we all made a point, without even talking about it because it's so obvious, we made a point of going to the most reactionary parts of the country we could find. Just partly out of curiosity. And partly, because you want to talk to them if you can. And we all had exactly the same experience. We all checked afterwards. Audiences were huge, they were all wearing fatigues and yellow ribbons, but it was very thin, collapsed almost in no time. He ended up with big, interest and applause and so on. You couldn't talk like that, even the kind of talk that all of us are giving, you couldn't have given to peace movement groups in the late 60s. And I think that's true in general. I mean, I was pretty surprised in the mid-80s, and some of my own stereotypes were broken when I went to places like, say, central Kansas, and, invited to a church group, and I figured there'd be 4 people in somebody's living room. And quite the contrary, big groups, and they knew way more about Central America than the people in Cambridge. They were more activists. They had direct contact. They'd been up and back. They'd dragged their Congress people down. They had all kind of information, a lot of information I'd never seen. This is part of this whole, I suspect, largely church-based network that spread through the Midwest and the Southwest, and that was really the core of the Solidarity movement. The centers of the 60s, like the elite universities, in part they're quieter, but in part they look quieter by comparison with everything else. There was nothing else in the 60s. And now the popular movements, I think, have deepened and they're spread and they've got deeper roots. And that's just why the Bush administration understands that you can't carry out the old-fashioned intervention because it would undercut political support. Look, take a look at the protests against the Iraq war again. I mean, everybody in the peace movement's lambasting themselves because they didn't succeed. But remember, there were big protests, hundreds of thousands of people before the war started. That's a historic breakthrough. You didn't get hundreds of thousands of people in Washington until 7 or 8 years after we were attacking South Vietnam. The idea of protest before you start bombing, that's unheard of. And the same is true of the Solidarity movement of the 60s, of the 80s. I think they broke new ground. There's kind of people-to-people connections that were established by these Middle America groups, which are really new, things like Witnesses for Peace. There was nothing like that in the Vietnam War. There was nobody living in Vietnamese villages. Well, those are big changes. I don't know anything in any protest movement that's been like that. Those are hopeful signs.
I agree. I've had this argument that I think there's more popular protests or it's very widespread, but I've had the feeling that the media, I guess I disagreed. I think about the 50s, there was a while in the 50s when the protest movement forced the media.
When?
Well, I don't know. Well, just the censorship, for instance, of the war. I myself learned what was happening. I don't think it's true that it was common knowledge that in the media that the peasants supported the Viet Cong, but that became common knowledge because more and more photographs of the captured Viet Cong were evident in the photographs of news photographs. We began to be able to piece together what was happening from seeing the contradictions between what the headlines said and what the photos showed.
That's true. See, but that has to do with density of coverage. Remember, you had 500,000 to 600,000 American soldiers there, and that meant that there was dense coverage. Incidentally, all the coverage was from the American side. There was no coverage from the Vietnamese side.
I know, but even with that, you could figure
Yeah, when you have dense coverage, things seep through, even though the media were extremely hawkish. Incidentally, the effect of the media has been studied, and it was to increase hawkishness.
Has been studied?
Yes. The effect of the media, you can detect it, It was to increase hawkishness, and that goes right through the Tet Offensive.
Wait, I missed the point there.
The effect of media coverage was to increase the hawkishness of the population.
Well, it didn't increase, but the protests were growing.
The protests were growing. I don't think so. I think the protests were growing for other reasons and independently, and in fact using a lot of alternative sources. And yes, they were using information that seeped through the media, but that's true today too. Like, I don't know if it was reported here, but a couple of days ago, Greenpeace and the Census Bureau both reported studies of Iraqi civilian dead after the war. And they both came up with numbers like 70 to 90,000. Well, that's, victims of U.S. bacteriological warfare. You got your eyes open, you can see that. It wasn't the New York Times. I don't know if it made the Washington Post.
I don't know. A lot of truth came out just from,
well, here's some truth that came out.
The fact that U.S. photographers were not allowed to go into Iraq this time.
That's not true.
Allowed to go into Grenada.
No, look, that is not true.
I think it's...
Look, it is not true. I mean, U.S. photographers never went to the areas that were under bombardment during the Vietnam War.
Well, we saw photographs of
From the American side.
Of villages. Yes,
From the American side. That's right, and the same was true here. You could go, I mean, when you went to the Basra Road, you saw the pictures from the American side.
Well, maybe there was just nothing to see in this war, but I
There was
why did they have all
your standards are different, and rightly. Your standards are now different than the standards of the 60s. In the 60s, there was no reporting from the other side. In the National Liberation Front run areas of the South, which are the main target of the U.S. attack, there was essentially nothing. I know of one alternative journalist who got in there. There was a very good Japanese journalist who wrote for Asahi Shimbun, kind of like New York Times. He went and reported from the Vietnamese side, and he had a big series that was in the main Japanese press, and some people translated and tried to circulate it. Nobody would touch it. Don't come near it. You know? They wouldn't allow reporting. Finally, Harrison Salisbury went to Hanoi. Hanoi was a special case. You had to be careful about bombing Hanoi because you get involved with Chinese and Russians and stuff, and you had embassies there and so on. He was denounced for going to Hanoi. That was considered a crime. The U.S. bombing of Laos was, that one I know personally because I was on the scene there for a while. It was completely suppressed. I mean, I was in Vientiane at a time when the whole American press corps was there because there were some fraudulent stories about the North Vietnamese offensive, which were completely fake. The whole press corps was in there, you know, CBS and all those guys. 20 miles outside of Vientiane, there were refugee camps where there were thousands, in fact tens of thousands, of people who had just been brought in by the CIA after their mercenary army had swept through the Plain of Jars, which at that point had been subjected to the heaviest bombing in history, you know, and just wiped out. I mean, I spent about 20 hours out there one week. The only guy I could get to go with me was a stranger for the Far Eastern Economic Review. The American press corps wouldn't go. They don't want to report that story. That's the way. And that was 1970. Let's take the early 70s. The heaviest bombing, that was the heaviest bombing up till then. It was surpassed by the U.S. bombing of Cambodia in 1973. During the U.S. bombing of Cambodia in 1973, there were plenty of American journalists in Phnom Penh. People like Sidney Schanberg, the conscience of the press, you know, Malcolm Brown, and so on. They were sitting in Phnom Penh. The bombing was not in Phnom Penh. It was off in the countryside. But it was easy to find out what had happened. There were 1.5 million refugees pouring into Phnom Penh at that time from deep in inner Cambodia who could tell you exactly what was happening. Well, I went through all the coverage. Dozens of articles by Sidney Schanberg and the rest of them. Nothing. You know, 2 or 3 sentences now and then. You take a look at the book The Killing Fields, at the movie, if you saw it, The Killing Fields. You remember it begins with an American bombing of a Khmer village and how awful it is and so on. And that's the one case that was covered by Sidney Schanberg. But why that case? Because they hit the wrong village. They hit the wrong village, so that was wrong. What about all the times when they hit the right village? There was nothing. No, that's not true. There was coverage from visitors. You got coverage at the time of the Tet Offensive. And the reason you got coverage at the time of the Tet Offensive, was the first time it was really on-the-scene coverage, was because up until the Tet Offensive, the reporters had pretty much been covering with the American military. And they mostly described what they were shown. The Tet Offensive, the military couldn't control it. And the reason was there were uprisings all over the place. So everybody was seeing the stuff outside their window. And they were photographing what's outside their window. And that was the first time, that's when you got, then after that you started getting the villages and suits and that sort of thing.
I don't know. All I know is I made film strips during that time. And I got practically all my photos from Life magazine and the New York Times. And I didn't even want the North Vietnamese photos because they would tell exactly the same story. But I mean, they couldn't.
There was a scattering from the American side, and in the Gulf War it was exactly the same.
No, it wasn't exactly
the same. Yes, it was.
Because I tried to get photographs.
Did you get photographs of you got photographs of the Basra Road?
Big photographs of women fighting on the other side. And during the Vietnam War, and this is part of what helped to instigate.
I understand, but think why.
Wait, there was tons of documentary evidence that women were taking the side of the Vietnam.
How come? Because the American soldiers were there. and where the American soldiers are, the American reporters are. Now, in the case of Iraq, where the same was true, where the American soldiers were, the American reporters were. And in fact, that's why you saw the Basra Road, and you didn't see the Iraqi villages because there were no American soldiers there.
No, because of the pictures, I made a study of this, the pictures of Iraqi women.
Were there any American soldiers who saw Iraqi women?
There were tons of pictures of Iraqi women, but they were always shown in the New York Times in veil. Now, the one...
Were there any, you're not answering my question. Were there any American soldiers there where there were Iraqi women?
Well, they had to have been.
No, they weren't, because the American soldiers were not, the American soldiers occupied South Vietnam, and therefore when an American reporter went out under military convoy to watch the magnificent things that the American soldiers were doing, which they then reported in uplifting prose, they were going to Vietnamese villages. That's not what happened in Iraq. What happened in Iraq is, again, where the American soldiers were, the American reporters were. The one difference was that this time there was an American reporter in Baghdad. There was no American reporter in Vietnamese.
American reporters in Baghdad took pictures of Iraqi women in veil, generally. They didn't take pictures of Iraqi women in blue jeans or Iraqi women carrying guns. Or if they did,
I don't think that's true. I mean, I don't watch much television, and it was only television, remember.
I'm talking about newspapers.
No, but there was nothing in the newspaper. The newspaper had no print journalists there.
Yes, there was.
Who?
I collected
Who?
pictures.
Who was American journalists there?
I don't know.
There weren't any.
They weren't always
It was Peter Arnett.
Yeah, like Time magazine is the only magazine that had a picture showing that there were Iraqi women soldiers. I looked through nowhere else did you see that.
Absolutely true and irrelevant, because that's even more than they did. It's more than they did during Vietnam. Because in Vietnam, they never showed pictures of Vietnamese fighting except when they were there with the American troops from the American side. Now, there was one case, there were 3 days when there was interaction between U.S. soldiers and Iraqis. That was the 3 days of the ground combat, and that's when you had extensive coverage, pictures, because the American troops went in with the American reporters. It was the same in the Vietnam War, except it was much worse there. It was much worse because it went on for years and years and years, and had plenty of opportunities to get in on the other side.
He saw all these fireworks, and he didn't see the damage that was done. That's
well, first of all, I don't think that's quite true, but secondly, I agree, and it's still a lot better than during the Vietnam War. So, for example, during the Vietnam War, did you ever see a picture of the city of Dinh, which in 1965 was bombed so heavily that you couldn't even find the foundations of buildings?